In this third lecture sequence, we're going to cover a range of topics. I'll begin with a conversation about the blues, because I think it's important as we are talking about the vernacular to introduce a discussion about the blues, which is one of the central sources of poetics and aesthetics in the context of African American culture, African American literary practice. In the next sequence, I'll make some comments about the function and importance of other forms of music, whether it's jazz, which is a topic we'll come back to later on in the course, and eventually, I think one will have to discuss hip hop as a function of the African American aesthetic. Then we'll move on to our first discussions about the slave narratives, and for this third sequence, I'll focus on Olaouda Equiano, the Nigerian enslaved man who gained his freedom, also known as Gustavas Vassa. I will talk a little bit about his life and about the work that he did, and of course about his narrative, which would be the first text that would focus on, as a whole, the narrative, interesting life of Olaouda Equiano. And then that would that should set us up for our fourth lecture series, which will focus on Frederick Douglass, and um, and then depending on how things are going, we'll go on to a few other slave narratives, because of course the slave narratives become an important framing for the discussion of African American literary practice. So first of all, the blues. It's a very interesting thing. There are a number of ways in which we can think of the blues and the ways in which we can source an idea of the blues. I think it's a given that the blues constitute one of the foundational forces in American music practice. I think it's impossible to consider the last 60 to 70, maybe 80 years of American life. Well, let's just call it the last 150 years of American life without thinking about the ubiquitous presence of the blues and the ubiquitous presence of the blues as a function of American understanding of itself. The interesting thing about the blues is that it has played a major role in different stages of American life in the last 150 years. And interesting scholars have written about the blues quite extensively and quite convincingly. And yet, fundamentally, the blues is a is a is a very simple. One would call it a simple form. Technically, as a form, it has a kind of simplicity to it. But obviously, its simplicity belies a sophistication and a complexity that allows it to be persistent and consistently influencing and shaping and transforming American society. Yet, inside the narrative of the blues is contained the very problems of American racial history, African American history, and the ways in which African American history intersects with what we would like to call more fundamentally American history. If we think about it, last time I spoke about the Negro spirituals. And if you think of the music itself, there's an interesting distinction that can be made where the Negro spiritual, which is directly related to the congregational practice of African Americans as a community, that is, singing songs collectively, The Negro spiritual and the spiritual songs, which would then lead to the gospels and so on, gospel songs, are communal, they're congregational. While there is a very private enactment of spirituals, that is in private prayer before God, and even contained in this communal and congregational form, the lyrics themselves have a kind of private intimacy. This is theologically fascinating because, in a sense, inside a Negro spiritual is the acknowledgement of a community of people, and yet at the same time, uh, an advocacy, a kind of clarity in articulating a very personal and individual prayer that is going towards God. So, therefore, God is communally enacted. That is the body of God, the body of Christ, the body of the community of people. And yet, inside of it, the singular prayer is the individual's relationship to God. This is a fascinating idea, in a sense. It's an idea that has resonance in evangelical thought. And I'm talking about evangelical thought that dates all the way back to um, the interesting move from Catholicism to Protestantism. And these often turned on the idea of the institutional collective relationship and the individual outworking of one's faith. That is, as Paul would say, that one must work out. Paul, the apostle, would say, work out your faith with fear and trembling. And that tension is somehow resolved in the Negro spirituals construction. So, oh freedom, oh freedom, oh freedom over me. And before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. This is a very personal lyric, a lyric that is articulating a first person experience. And yet, this is a song that is sung collectively by a community, so that as the community listens to each other, it is also listening to individuals following the same path towards a faith. I make the point about the Negro spiritual being a form that is intentionally representing a collective sense, and yet a form that still recognizes the individual. I make that point because I think it's really, really important to recognize that the expression of the Negro spiritual is, we talk about it as radical and as revolutionary because, in a sense, it challenges the moral ethics of white supremacy, and white supremacy that presumes that the only valid relationship between God and human beings is a relationship between themselves as a white society and God. That is, white European people become the chosen people, the articulated chosen people, to the exclusion of all others. And what these African Americans were doing was something that was intentionally and calculatedly challenging that idea and saying that they were the chosen people, and those who were friends of them, those who collectively joined with them, were also part of that chosen people, unlike the oppressors, unlike the enslavers, unlike the forces that were seeking the destruction of God's people, who were not God's people. So there's that revolutionary act. But yet, inside of this notion of the individual's lyric articulation of themselves, that is an articulation that says, I will go home to my Lord. The phrase, my Lord, the phrase, to my God, is a radical phrase because it's a phrase that centralizes the I, the individual, the first person. And in that act of the first person, there is individuality being celebrated, and individuality then connotes to one's humanity. the legitimacy of one's humanity, the idea that, in fact, I am a human, I'm a person. Am I not a man? Am I not a woman? Am I not human? And this is being articulated in a context in which everything else is conspiring against that idea. In a sense that the very freedom, the very essence of one's humanity is being oppressed and destroyed and taken away by the removal of these elements of what we call human rights, human freedom. These articulations to reproduce, to love, to form community, to learn, to create, and to roam the world freely by choice. So the Negro spiritual, I'm suggesting, speaks of community and yet speaks of the human individual. And in articulating the experience of the individual, it is in fact articulating the experience of the valid humanity. It has this connection, therefore, to the blues. The blues emerges, some have argued, in the middle of the 1800s. And it emerged and remained in its most core sensibility and in counter-distinction to the Negro spirituals, fundamentally secular. Now, there are many ways in which the blues exist as an aesthetic and as a poetics and as a sensibility within the Negro spiritual, within the gospel, within the idea of the Christian sensibility. But in its genesis and in its enactment over the years, even among African Americans, and especially among African Americans, there is a counter distinction created between the religious line of spirituals, gospel songs, and the church. That is the righteous path. That is the path of God's people. And the secular, sin-praised part, which is told by the narrative of the blues. So the blues was for those who had fallen afoul of the faith. The blues were for those who were not excited about articulating a spiritual sensibility. And so on the one hand, there is that fundamental denial of that spiritual sensibility. But on the other hand, more importantly, where the Negro spirituals and the gospels and the spiritual songs are fundamentally communal, the blues are doggedly, defiantly individual. And in a sense, the idea of the individual moving through the world, dealing with elements that are destructive and dangerous, and yet a kind of sensibility, a kind of lyric sensibility of self. That idea, that individual against the world, that individual with his own or her own sensibility and idea and views of the world, driving them, the self-made individual becomes the archetype, the fundamental archetype of this notion of Americanness. It is in the blues that this begins to be articulated. So if we think of the blues in that way, that is, the blues are expressing the experience of African Americans and the experience of African Americans facing the oppressive systems, whether it's slavery, whether it's Jim Crow, and them finding ways to articulate those feelings, those thoughts through song and through formal song. When we begin to understand that, then we begin to understand that in this combination of the blues and the Negro spirituals, we have inside of it a kind of distinctive Americanness. And this is what the African American experience contributes. And it's possible to then think of, somebody to think of individuals who would consider themselves along the blues line and then people who consider themselves along the lines of the gospel, right? In the African American tradition, there are these lines, these positions, and they seem contradictory, but they are also complementary in their very interesting ways. What is the blues? What is the blues? I think we would think of the blues as sad music. This is typically what we would think of as the blues, sad music. So the question is it just simply a matter of sadness or articulating sadness? And this is the key question that we'll pursue in the next section.